Mr. President, reserving the right to object, and let me be clear, the nature of my objection is not about the fact that this legislation authorizes about $280 billion, I think, for health care for veterans that resulted from toxic exposure. And it creates new categories of eligibility, and it contemplates this and authorizes this $280 billion of additional spending over 10 years. What everybody should be aware of is that absent this legislation, existing statute already obligates the federal government through the VA to spend about $400 billion over the next 10 years on veterans' health care that results from veterans being exposed to toxic circumstances during their service. So there's $400 billion that pre-existed this bill, and there's $280 billion of new spending. Now, the $400 billion that we were already going to spend, and we will spend, is put under the discretionary spending caps in that category of discretionary spending because, as you know, Mr. President, discretionary spending is limited. There's a cap every year on how much can be spent in this discretionary spending category. There's one other category of spending around here, that's mandatory spending. That's not subject to caps, that's just unlimited, whatever's required. Now, the legislation puts the $280 billion in new spending in the mandatory spending category. And we can argue about whether that's a good idea or not. I don't think it's a great idea, but that's not what's really outrageous about what's going on here. What's really outrageous is in this legislation, they take the $400 billion that was going to be spent anyway, that's already pre-existing under existing statute. They take that out of discretionary spending and move it over to mandatory spending. Now, why would they do a thing like that? Why would that be necessary? To move $400 billion that's already authorized to be spent under current law, move it out of the discretionary and into the mandatory spending. The reason is because that way you create a big gaping hole in the discretionary spending category, which can be filled with another $400 billion of totally unrelated spending. Who knows on what? That's why it had to be moved out of discretionary and into mandatory spending. Mr. President, my objection isn't about the substance of this bill. It's about this budgetary gimmick that's designed to allow hundreds of billions of dollars of additional spending on totally unrelated, who knows what categories. We've got inflation hitting a 40-year high. We've got a government that's been spending trillions of dollars, too much money, printing the money to spend, and everybody sees it every day at the pump, at the grocery store, everywhere. And what this gimmick does is it makes it possible to spend yet another $400 billion. This is terrible policy. So I'm going to suggest a modification to the unanimous consent request from my friend, and he is my friend from Montana. And that would be, it's very simple. It says nothing about the $280 billion in new spending that's permitted under this legislation. It simply would keep the $400 billion that we were going to spend anyway, keep it right in the category that it's always been in. Keep it in the discretionary spending category so that it doesn't create this hole that gets filled with another $400 billion on who knows what. So that's what my amendment does. My amendment wouldn't reduce spending on veterans' health care by a penny. It wouldn't in any way impede the ability of veterans to get the health care that they need as a result of toxic exposures. It has nothing to do with that. It's only about preventing huge excessive spending in other categories, who knows what, that would be permitted under this bill. So, Mr. President, therefore, I ask unanimous consent that the Senator modify his request to include my amendment to the Tester resolution, that the amendment be considered and agreed to, that the resolution as amended be agreed to, and the motions to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table without intervening action or debate.